Chapter 18. Jesus Christ, Westerfield, what the hell did you think you were doing? Wallace Canning crouched forward over his desk, hands braced on his blotter as if he meant to leap over it, physically attack the man standing in front of it. His face was congested with fury and his eyes blazed, but Colonel Brian Westerfield stood his ground. I didn't do anything, he replied. He spoke quietly, but there was an edge to his voice, not quite a tremble, but an edge, which suggested he was less calm than he appeared. Well, somebody fucking well did, Canning spat. You stooped. He shut his mouth with a click, dragged himself back under control, and forced himself back into his chair. Westerfield started to speak, but the savage chop of a hand cut him off, and Canning closed his eyes. He inhaled deeply, tension shuddering in his muscles, and made himself think. Thank God the Admiral had departed for the Republic before this fiasco exploded. He swallowed a bitter, half-hysterical giggle at his own choice of verb and opened his eyes. All of their careful work, their cover plan at the lab, the false records, all of it, for nothing, for worse than nothing. The NPA would never rest now that the criminals had murdered almost 60 of its field agents, and if they didn't find the false trail they were supposed to find, they might. All right, he grated more calmly. I'm waiting. What happened and how? I passed the initial warning to Somerville exactly as we discussed, Westerfield said in a very careful voice. As you know, we had to warn him since he already knew we were wired into the NPA. If he hadn't gotten any advance warning at all, his variant in Matsuko would have smelled a rat for sure when they interrogated his people after the bust and found out the organization hadn't even tried to save their operation. And I know why we decided to warn him, Canning interrupted coldly, but I also know you weren't supposed to actually tell him the raid was coming. Damn it, Colonel, they were supposed to get caught. That's what I've been trying to tell you, sir, Westerfield said almost desperately. I didn't warn them about raid. I never sent them a word about it. What? Canning tipped his chair back with an abrupt movement and glared at his subordinate. Then how did they know? I can only speculate, sir, but Somerville did think he was in charge of security. If you want it, my best guess is that he had his own spotters out to give him a second information source. They must have tipped him his variant was coming, because I certainly didn't. But why in hell did he blow the lab? Canning complained in a less angry, almost querulous voice. We never told him to do that. That may have been my fault after all, sir, Westerfield admitted unhappily. He asked me what to do with the hardware, and I didn't give him any specific orders. Canning glared at him, and Westerfield's own resentment flared. Damn it, sir, I thought he'd just cut and run. Why shouldn't I have? I didn't know what kind of lunatic he was. Ambassador Gallant's people recruited him on Manticore. If they knew he was some kind of loose warhead, they never should have gone anywhere near him, however good or politically embarrassing his credentials were. All right, Canning waved a hand in a gesture mild midway between anger and placation and bit his lip. We can't undo it. At least the fucking Manicorans killed him for us. But you must have known some of the rifles were in the area, Colonel. I swear to God I didn't, sir. Westerfield's face was taut. As far as I know, every one of the rifles we've delivered is still cached and shaped in the shaman's cave. In fact, I ordered the count made at Site 1 as soon as the shit hit the fan. They haven't completed it yet, but so far the numbers have checked out perfectly. I don't think those rifles were ours at all, sir. Oh crap, Canning muttered, dragging his hands through his hair and staring at the blotter. They must have been stealthy made, sir, Westerfield said more calmly. The shamans had to hand them out for training sessions. We'd collect them all afterward, but maybe one of those damn abos took the idea home with him. If we're going to give them weapons that look like they can be native built, then they have to be one the natives can build, after all. It just never occurred to anyone they might figure out how to make their own gunpowder as well and set up a shop of their own. Now this is just fucking wonderful, Canning groaned. He closed his eyes in pain, then opened them and impaled Westerfield with a glare. Even if you didn't give the order to blow the lab, Colonel, the field op is your responsibility. This is your mess. You clean it up. But how? Westerfield took a step closer to the desk, his voice almost pleading. I don't know. Canning pounded a fist gently on the blotter for a moment, then sucked in a deep breath. All right, the NPA knows it was an off-world operation. They still don't know it was us, and and the maniac didn't blow the power relay, so when they track them back, at least that evidence will still point to a domestic Manticoran operation, right? Westerveld nodded silently, and Canning's jaw worked in thought. He ought to report this. He knew he should, but if he did, upstairs would probably cancel the entire op, and if he couldn't hang it all on Westerveld, the Admiral and ONI would crucify him. On the other hand, he just told the Colonel there was still no direct evidence linking Haven to the massacre. Alright, if Harrington and Matsuko didn't know Haven was behind it, what did they know that could hurt him? The rifles. They know about the fucking rifles, and neither of them were likely to miss the potential danger they represented. So that meant they might try to make some sort of contingency plans. But if they didn't know about the scope of Haven's own plans, then their precautions could hardly be enough to stop him. He gritted his teeth, knowing full well he was grasping at straws. Yet straws were all he had. If he reported back and the operation was scrubbed, and his career was scrubbed with it, he'd find himself hauled home and buried in one of the parole housing units on Haven, drawing a basic living stipend right alongside all the other dulest scum as an example to other fuck-ups. And he came from one of the aristocratic legislature families. All of his friends, all the other useless drones drawing the BLS with him, everyone would know about his disgrace. They'd laugh at him, mock him, and he couldn't face it. He couldn't. Yet what option did he have? Unless he forced his jaws to relax and straightened his shoulders. If he warned ONI and the operation was cancelled, he was ruined. If he didn't warn them, the operation was launched on schedule but failed, he'd still be ruined for not having warned them. But if the operation succeeded, he could survive. His family was owed enough debts by other legislatures. They could carry it off, possibly even applaud him for his iron nerve and resolve in driving the op to success despite his handicaps. There was only one chance in 3, but a 33% chance was infinitely more than 0, and it was the only one that offered him survival. "All right, Colonel," he said coldly. "Here's what you're going to do. First, get in touch with your NPA contacts. If Harrington doesn't find that tap on Mitsuko's power collector on her own, you make damn sure someone points her at it. More than that, I want a watch kept on their deployments. If they start fortifying up the enclaves or any of Harrington's Marines get deployed planetside, I want to know. Then get your ass out to the main site. I don't care how you do it, but you sit on the shaman for 3 more weeks. 3 weeks, Colonel. If Young isn't back by then we'll kick the operation off without him. Understood?" Westerveld cocked his head, his eyes narrow and speculative, and Canning met them with a flat glare. He could almost hear gears turning in the Colonel's head, feel the other men's following his own chain of logic, and then Westerveld gave a slow nod as the totals came together for him as well. If Canning survived, he survived. If Canning went down, he went down with his superior. "Yes, sir," the Colonel said flatly. I understand entirely, Mr. Canning." He jerked another sharper nod at the console, and vanished to the office door. "Your ticket, sir." The Silesian trade factor handed over the small chip with a smile. His freight line employers offered limited passenger accommodations aboard their bulk carriers, but this was their very first passenger the fact factor had ever booked from Medusa. "Thank you," the man who didn't look a thing like and who had the papers to prove he wasn't Denver Somerville said courteously. He slipped the chip into a pocket, rose with a coolly pleasant nod, and left the office. He stood outside it for a moment, gazing across at the Haven consulate, and a smile touched his mouth. The pieces had started coming together for him the moment one of his local contacts arrived at his hiding place to report seeing the boss dash out of the Havenite enclave and head for the outback. That had been all he'd had to know to realize he and the lab personnel had been set up by the real employers, and why. He'd been tempted to do a little something about that, but cooler counsel had prevailed. After all, he was already free and clear largely because he'd set up the air car pilot to play button man. More than that, it was possible, even probable, that whatever Haven was up to would be even more upsetting to the NPA and the Navy than the drug lab itself had been. If the boss pulled it off after all, that would be enough to earn Somerville's grudging forgiveness. If he blew it, then the very people Somerville despised would punish him for his treachery. He smiled sorry, Commander McKean, Raphael Cardonis said, but we're moving as fast as we can. There's no load on the relay now. The final stage was an omnidirectional receiver. We're working our way through the possible lines of sight, but with no power flow to tag, we're having to do it all by eye. I'm afraid it's going to take time, sir. Understood. Alistair McKean nodded and patted the younger officer on the shoulder with absent gentleness. I know you're doing your best, Raven. Let me know the instant you have something. Aye, aye, sir. Cardonis turned back to his station and McKean crossed to the command chair. He eased himself down into it and glanced unhappily at the closed hatch to the captain's briefing room. The catastrophic consequences of the raid on the drug lab had shocked him to the core, and a subdued air of depression hovered over the ship. He knew the captain blamed herself for it. She was wrong. It wasn't her fault, nor was it the fault of anyone else aboard Fearless, but the entire crew seemed to feel a personal sense of guilt over the disaster, one that cut all the deeper because of their earlier sense of achievement. But there was something else under the guilt and depression. Anger. A seething hatred for whoever had set those charges with murder in his heart. He could feel it pulsing about him, bare-fanged and ugly, and it throbbed deep inside him as well. For the first time since Harrington had taken command, he was truly one with the ship's company, no longer buttressed off by his own resentment and private despair, and the need to rend and destroy simmered in his blood. He folded his hands in his lap and looked up as a chime sounded from the comm section. He turned his head, and his eyes narrowed as he saw Webster stiffen and begin punching buttons. He was over on the right side of the panel in the secure channel section, and something about the way his hands moved rang a warning in McKean's brain. He slid from the command chair and padded over to the comm officer's shoulder just as Webster plugged a message board into his terminal and downloaded the unscrambled message to it. The lieutenant spun his chair and started to spring erect, and then stopped as he saw the exec. What is it, Webster? McKean asked quickly, worried by the lieutenant's pale face and tight expression. It's a priority message, sir, from Lieutenant Venizelos of Basilisk Control. He says. The lieutenant broke off and extended the board, and McKean's face clenched as he scanned the brief, terse message. He raised his eyes and locked them with the lieutenant's. No one hears about this until the captain or I tell you different, Webster, he said very softly. Clear. Yes, sir, Webster said equally quietly. The exec nodded and turned on his heel, striding briskly across the bridge. You have the watch, Mr. Webster, he called over his shoulder, and tapped sharply on the briefing room's admittance panel. The hatch hissed open, and he disappeared through it. Honor finished the message and laid the board gently on the table. Her face was pale but composed. Only her eyes showed the true depth of their attention as she looked up at McKean, and the exec shifted his weight uneasily. So, she said at last, glanced at the chronometer. The message had taken 10 hours to reach them. Hoffman's carrier boat would arrive within another 20. Yes, ma'am. He has to be coming out to see you personally, Captain, McKean said softly. What makes you so certain, exec? Ma'am, it can't be for any other reason. Not on a crown courier. That's a deliberate statement, a proof of his political clout. And if he were just coming out to check on his own boundaries, he'd have come in one of his own ships. And it can't be to see Dame Estelle either. He must have already hit every political lever he has back home. And if he couldn't get Countess Nukiyev to interfere, he knows damn well he won't get Dame Estelle to. That only leaves you, Captain. Honor nodded slowly. There were gaping holes in McKean's logic, but he was right. She could feel that he was, and there was genuine concern in his eyes and voice. Concern, she thought, which wasn't for himself. It was for his ship, and perhaps, just possibly, for his captain as well. All right, exec, she said. You may be wrong. I don't think you are, but whether you are or not, it doesn't change our duties or our priorities, does it? No, ma'am, McKean said quietly. Very well, then. She looked sightlessly around the briefing room for a moment, trying to think. I want you to concentrate on working with Raven and Germain's ground party. Nail the relay's power sources down for me. In the meantime, I'll have a word with Dame Estelle and tell her who's coming to call on us. Yes, ma'am. Good. Honor rubbed her temple, feeling Nimitz's tension on the back of her chair. She sounded cool and confident, she thought, the conscientious captain, concerned only with her duty, while her stomach nodded with something much too much like fear and her mind filled with uncertainty. But she had no choice. Her duty was all she knew how to do. Yet, for the first time in her career, when she reached out for the steady weight of responsibility, it wasn't enough. Not enough. Good, she repeated, lowering her hand from her temple. She stared at her fingers for a second, then looked back up at McKean. At the exact thought, her face looked even younger, far more vulnerable than he had ever seen it. A familiar flicker of resentment stirred within him like an involuntary mental reflex, but with it came another, stronger impulse. "We'll take care of it, ma'am," he heard himself say, and saw the surprise in the backs of her eyes. He wanted to say something else, but even now that was more than he could do. "Thank you, Exec." She inhaled deeply, and he saw her face change. The captain was back, settled over her bony features like a shield, and she squared her shoulders. "In the meantime," she said more briskly, "I'll ask Dame Estelle if she can get Barney's variant up here. I want him to sit down with Papadopoulos and myself to discuss these new Medusa weapons." "Yes, ma'am." McKean stepped back, braced to attention for just a second, and turned away. The hatch his closed behind him. "There it is, Mr. Tremaine. See?" The NPA private stepped back from the electronic glass, his swivel mounted atop the power relay on the ridge above the crater which had once been a drug laboratory. It had taken hours to track the buried cable from the transmitter below to this point, and the real problem had started then. For the receptor wasn't a direct space uplink, and it was omnidirectional. They hadn't had a clue where its relay was, but now Tremaine peered through the glasses, and his face tightened as he saw the telltale roundness of a parabolic receiving disc. It was on a much higher ridge, almost 20 kilometers away, but that smooth arc couldn't possibly be a natural formation, even if it had been painted to look like the rock around it. "I think you're right, Chris." He looked down at the bearing ring on the glass's mouth, then raised his wrist comb to his mouth. "Here, Skipper." Yamada's voice came down from the pinnace hovering overhead. "I think Rogers has spotted it. Take a look at that ridge to the north bearing." He looked back at the ring. 018 true from this relay. "Just as that, Skipper." The pinnace shifted slightly, and Yamada came back up on the comm almost instantly. "Tell Chris he's got good eyes, Skip. That's it, all right." "Good." Tremaine gave the NPA man a tight nod of approval, and then looked back up at the pinnace. "Have Ruth pick us up, and let's get over there." "Aye, aye, sir. We're on it." "Major Papadopoulos, ma'am," McKean said, and stood aside as Captain Nikos Papadopoulos, Royal Manticoran Marines, marched into Honor's briefing room. There could only be one captain aboard a ship of war, where any uncertainty over who someone was referring to in the midst of a critical situation could be fatal, so Papadopoulos received the courtesy promotion to avoid that confusion, and he looked every centimeter a major, despite his captain's insignia, like someone who just stepped out of a recruiting poster as he paused inside the catch. Barney's variant was a real major, but far less Bruce-looking. In point of fact, he looked like hell. He'd had exactly no sleep in 29 hours, and 61 of his best friends were killed or wounded, and Otter was fairly positive he hadn't even changed his clothes. Papadopoulos glanced at the NPA named Major and clicked to attention, but there was a dubious look in his eyes. The Marine was dark, despite his auburn hair, with quick, alert eyes, and he moved with an assurance just short of cockiness, and the limber power of the Royal Manticoran Marine Corps' strenuous physical training program. He was probably all spring steel and leather, and dangerous as a Kodiak Max, just like the poster said, Honor thought sardonically, but he looked like an untested recruit beside its very disdained and weary expression. "You sent for me, Captain," he said. "I did. Sit down, Major." Honor pointed to an empty chair, and Papadopoulos sat neatly, looking alertly back and forth between his superiors. "Have you read the report I sent you?" Honor asked. He nodded. "Good. I've asked Major its variant here to give you any additional background you require." "Required for what, ma'am?" Papadopoulos asked when she paused. "For the formulation of a response plan, Major, in the event of an attack on the Delta Enclaves by Medusans armed with similar weapons." "Oh." Papadopoulos furrowed his brown for a moment, then shrugged. "I'll get right on it, ma'am, but I don't see any problems." He smiled, but his smile faded as the captain looked back at him expressionlessly. He glanced sideways at his variant and stiffened, for the NPA wasn't an NPA Major when he wasn't expressionless at all. His bloodshot eyes looked right through the Marine with something too close to contempt for Papadopoulos' comfort, and he turned defensively back to Honor. "I'm afraid I can't share your confidence, Major," she said calmly. "I think the threat may be somewhat more serious than you believe." "Ma'am," Papadopoulos said crisply, I still have 93 Marines aboard ship. I have battle armor for a full platoon, 35 men and women, with pulse rifles and heavy weapons for the remainder of the company. We can handle any bunch of stealthies armed with flintlocks. He stopped, jaw clenched, and added another ma'am, almost as an afterthought. Bullshit. The single flat, cold word came not from honor, but from Barney as variant, and Papadopoulos flushed as he glared at the older man. I beg your pardon, sir, he said in a voice of ice. I said bullshit, as Varian replied equally coldly. You'll go down there and you'll look pretty and you'll beat the holy living hell out of any single bunch of Medusans you come across, and that'll be fucking all you do while the nomads eat the rest of the off-worlders for breakfast. Papadopoulos' face went as white as it had been red. To his credit, at least half his anger was at hearing such language in his commanding officer's presence, but only half, and he glared at the haggard, unshaven Varian's wrinkled uniform. Major, my people are Marines. If you knew anything about Marines, then you know we do our job. His clipped voice made no effort to hide his own contempt, and Honors started to raise an intervening hand, but his Varian lurched to his feet before she got it up, and she let it fall back into her lap as he leaned towards Papadopoulos. Let me tell you something about the Marines, Sonny, the NPA man spat. I know all about them, believe me. I know you're brave, loyal, trustworthy, and honest. The bitter derision in his voice could have stripped paint from the bulkheads. I know you can knock a Kodiak Max on his ass in 2 clicks with a pulse rifle. I know you can pick a single gnat out of a cloud of them with a plasma gun and strangle hexaboomers with your bare hands. I even know your battle armor gives you the strength of 10 because your heart is pure. But this ain't no boarding action, Major Papadopoulos, and it's no field exercise either. This is for real, and your people don't have the least damn idea what they're fucking around with down there. Papadopoulos sucked in an angry breath, but this time Honor did raise her hand before she could speak. Major Papadopoulos. Her cool soprano wrenched him around to face her, and she smiled faintly. Perhaps you aren't aware that before joining the NPA, Major Varian was a Marine. Papadopoulos twitched in shock, and her smile grew. In point of fact, he served in the Corps for almost 15 years, completing his final tour as Command Sergeant Major for the Marine Detachment on Saganami Island. Papadopoulos looked back at his Varian and swallowed his hot retort. The Saganami Marines were chosen from the elite of the Corps, and they made up the training and security detachment at the Naval Academy, serving as both examples and challenges for the midshipmen who might one day aspire to command Marines. And they were there because they were the best, the very best. Major, he said quietly, I apologize. He met the older man's red-rimmed eyes unflinchingly, and the NPA man slumped back into his chair. Oh well, his Varian waved a hand vaguely and flopped back into his chair. Not your fault, Major. I shouldn't have popped off that way. He rubbed his forehead and blinked wearily. But all the same, you don't have any idea what you're getting into down there. Perhaps not, sir, Papadopoulos said, his voice much more level as he recognized the exhaustion and pain behind the NPA Major swaying belligerence. In fact, you're right. I spoke without thinking. If you have any advice to offer, I'd be most grateful to hear it, Major. All right, then. His Varian managed a tired, lopsided grin. The thing is, we don't have any idea how many of those rifles are out there, what the nomads are planning to do with them, but you might want to bear this in mind, Major Papadopoulos. We fitted the thing with a standard buttstock and test fired it. It's got a kick you wouldn't believe, but Sharon Koenig was right. It's also got an effective aim range of somewhere over 200 meters. It could use better sights, but a single hit will kill an unarmored human being at the range with no trouble at all. He leaned back in his chair and inhaled deeply. The problem is that your people can undoubtedly trash any of them you see, but you won't see them unless they want you to. Not in the bush. A Medusan nomad can crawl across a pool table without your seeing him if he didn't want you to. And while your body armor may protect you, it won't protect any unarmored civilians. Yes, sir, Papadopoulos said even more quietly. But is it really likely that we'll see some sort of mass uprising? We don't know. Frankly, I doubt it, but that doesn't mean we won't. If it's only a series of small-scale incidents, then my people could probably handle. But someone's been dumping Makoa out there by the air lorry load, as well as teaching them how to make guns. A A major incident certainly isn't out of the question. If it comes at one of the Delta City stages, they should be able to at least hold their walls until we can get to them. If it comes at the off-world enclaves, though, it's Varian shrugged tiredly. Most of them are wide open, Major Papadopoulos, and they don't even know it. Their security people haven't even brushed back the moss of the approaches to establish security or kill zones, and he smiled again, an achingly weary but genuine smile. Ain't none of them grunts like us. I understand, Major. Papadopoulos smiled back, then looked at Honor. Ma'am, I'm sorry I seemed overconfident. With your permission, I'd like to take Major Varian down to Marine Country and get my platoon commanders and Sergeant Major Jenkins involved in this. Then I'll try to give you a response plan that has some thought behind it for a change. I think that sounds like a reasonable idea, Major, and Honor said mildly, then glanced at Varian. On the other hand, it might be an even better idea to get some food in the Major Varian and lock him in the cabin for a few hours sleep before you confer. Now that's a real good idea, Captain. Varian's voice was slurred and he listed noticeably as he eased himself to his feet. But if Major Papadopoulos doesn't mind, I think I'd like a shower first. Can do, Major Papadopoulos said promptly, and Honor smiled as she watched him escort a staggering Varian from her briefing room.